Oh, the Gadsden House, yeah, there's a thing. It was a toothless Appalachian maid. She could be beautiful, but in truth she was not at the time. It was given as a wedding present by a Christopher Gadsden, a Revolutionary War hero with a somewhat dark and unrecorded past that we've become aware of, to his son-in-law and daughter, built about 1798. For Charleston, it was one of the larger antebellum mansions in town, and it had been for sale for around 10 years, something like that.
Christopher Gadsden served on the Marine Committee, which was in charge of the newly formed Continental Navy. And at that time, he designed the Gadsden Flag in 1775 for the U.S. Navy. And it features a coiled rattlesnake as well as the quote, "Don't tread on me." The house stayed in the Gadsden family throughout the early 1800s. In the 1990s, an agreement between Historic Charleston Foundation and Gadsden House LC turned the Gadsden House into a private medical leech museum owned by Dr. Roy Sawyer.
An interesting fella owned it. He'd made his money from the pharmacological uses of leech saliva. So the house actually had a leech museum and a bleeding museum in it, full of lots of things that looked like soup bowls that apparently held pints and pints of Georgian blood in their time. He didn't need the money especially, but he did want to sell. He was getting on rather in years and living with his wife now in South Wales, in the UK. So what we did was he approached him with a deal where we would put whatever it took to convert it into what it should have been, and he owner financed with a balloon in 3 years' time. So I guess I'd call that a win-win.
At that time, before we began, the building was converted into apartments as well as office spaces for local businesses.
We'd looked at this place a number of times and couldn't quite find a good application for it. It had a very limited number of rooms. They were huge rooms, 16, 18 feet high ceilings. Very grand in its time, but you couldn't subdivide, you couldn't put elevators in. Historic Charleston Foundation had easements both inside and out.
Because of the interior easement, the elevator would have ruined the footprint of the historic portion of the house. And then at the same time, having an elevator shaft on the exterior would have had a negative impact on the aesthetics of the exterior.
So you're dealing with an administrative nightmare. It was under repaired, there was a lot of deferred maintenance, it was under rented, so it was unmortgageable.
I think it would be difficult for this house to become a private residence again. So transforming it into a commercial use has been always the goal, but it's been hard to find the right owner and the right use for the property. And having this space be used and restored as an events venue actually was a really perfect fit because it didn't have as much of a negative impact on the historic fabric in the building.
The Gadsden House project has been an awesome one to undertake, knowing that we align ourselves with people in the community that are like-minded or have a approach that is in line with our vision. We do that. We source out those opportunities. A great candidate that we aligned ourselves with was the King Street Hospitality Group. They handle all of our bookings, insurance, and event planning as far as the bar setup. Having that relationships makes my job easy, just focusing on the finance and the day-to-day numbers.
I have been looking at that house for a year and a half, 2 years. I talked to Mike, who is one of the owners, who is also the owner of our company, that we wanted a new venue. We have 2 other places, and we wanted to keep expanding our spaces in Charleston. It's growing. It's the #1 destination wedding city in the country. So it's a prime, I'm losing my
prime spot.
Yeah.
Good market right now.
Yes. And so we have been looking at that for a while. We met Chris Lee Jones, Luxury Simplified, partnered on that, and that's how we became involved.
The Gadsden House was started in the 4th quarter of last year and acquired, I would say, roughly in October. Began some preliminary phases on the site, at the end of October, and it really hit full speed at the turn of the year.
The risk with historic renovations, and it always is a risk, is you never really know what you're dealing with until you strip the bandages off.
There's a wedding in 3 weeks there, right?
There is, yes.
Do you know something we don't know?
I think you guys know something I don't know because I've seen that place and I don't know how
There's gonna be a wedding. Surprisingly, the bride and groom thus far have been very laid back. They are from Charleston, so they can ride by every day and see the progress. It may not be perfect, but we're not gonna not have that wedding there.
We started initial demolition and investigation work in November last year. We had to wait for city permits, so the actual construction didn't start for another 4 months or so.
The front end was a little slow, just getting through city ordinance, with the help of a Historic Charleston Foundation and others, being able to move. When you have guys in line to do work for you, and if you're delayed, then they move on to other projects, which creates a different timeline gap. And if that timeline isn't met, there's other residual costs, that come into play that you have to factor.
Well, there were practical challenges such as the usual termites. You always find those. There's no point in even doing a termite inspection. You know the little darlings are going to be there, and you have to deal with that. And there were physical constraints such as Historic Charleston Foundation had easements that we needed to satisfy the requirements of those easements. Building code sometimes had contradictory requirements for sprinkler systems, for example, that we had to get into the building but without damaging beyond the minimum the historic fabric of that building.
It was a process to just kind of work through the ins and outs, make sure everyone was in compliance, making sure I had full detail of the documentation. Obviously, being a historic building, we qualify for federal historic tax credits as well as state credits.
And it's a busy city right now. There are a lot of cranes working and a very few staff in the permitting departments. So that took some 5 months to get final permits, although we got a hard end date in that a wedding is booked for 3 weeks from now, being the 1st of August.
I could honestly say we had probably between 60 to 100 people on site working on this building, roughly about 40 direct subs and then their staff.
Sometimes it's difficult or scary for homeowners who have an interior easement. They're concerned about all the restrictions and the review of any changes that they want to the interior.
There's original wood lath and plaster throughout the house here at Gadsden, and we've endeavored to preserve it wherever we could. So anytime that there had to be a removal of the original plaster, we then went back with wood lath and a scratch coat of plaster, which is what you see here, and then there'll be another 2 or 3 coats of lime plaster mortar that will go on top of this scratch coat.
I worked with Chris and Tim Seitz throughout the project. As my job as the easement manager, I have to review all changes to the building. And the objective was really to make sure that all of these changes would be appropriate to the historic building and that as much historic material was retained throughout the restoration project.
I think with a project of this size, it's 8,000 square feet. You have to be sympathetic to the past, but given it's going to be an event space with capacity nearing 500, you have to be able to deal with that as well. So for example, the piazzas, although structurally they were sound, we still stripped them off because if we have 40 or 50 people dancing rhythmically on the piazzas, having had quite a lot of alcohol, they're just not made to take that physical load.
The columns were in pretty bad shape, and so we want for preservation, the main philosophy is to keep as much historic material as possible, and then just patch as much as you can.
We had a site visit from the Board of Architectural Review who told us that we couldn't replace the columns, we had to repair them. So in order to do that, we ordered solid pieces of wood from a local mill shop, and then we scarfed the pieces into the existing columns. 2 feet up on all of the columns have been replaced, as well as column bases and plinth blocks and all new railing system.
The windows, we took 52 220-year-old windows out because thermally they really weren't very good at all.
We've removed each of the sashes. We put them in a steam box so that we could remove the glazing, all the paint. Then we've reinserted all the original glass and glaze and then put them back into the window. Here in the second floor parlor of Gadsden House, it's the largest room in the house with 16-foot ceilings. Unfortunately, it was largely destroyed by Hurricane Hugo, so all the original plaster and lath was removed and new drywall was installed. When we found the house, there was no crown or no trim in this particular room, and so we painstakingly recreated all of the trim on each of the windows, and the crown, as you see around, is 7 different pieces.
One of the things that was important and called out specifically in the covenant document was that the fireplace mantles were retained and protected.
The fireplace mantle that was installed after Hugo was an off-the-shelf fireplace mantle that you could buy at any lumber store. We took photographs of all the other mantles throughout the house and had one of our craftsmen recreate a new mantle with much more detail. We took that drawing and worked with the Historic Charleston Foundation to approve the design, and then recreated something that I think is absolutely magnificent and is certainly appropriate to the style of home here.
Most of the medallions that you see on the ceilings disappeared over time, and Luxury Simplified actually custom made all of the medallions you see on the ceilings.
When we found the house, there were no medallions in any of the main rooms. So we hired architectural plasterer Mike Lauer to recreate some ceiling medallions both here in the main parlor and each of the other rooms. And this is just a sample of the template to get a sense of the size. This is 60 inches wide that will go in the middle of the ceiling from which the chandelier will hang. Here on the 3rd floor, we're turning this room into a bridal suite, essentially where the bride and her bridesmaid can get ready for a wedding. So we've set aside a very large room that will finish as a living room, as a living space. Around the corner here, we will have a full kitchen and a full bath.
That brick wall was in pretty poor condition. Apparently, over the years, some woman had been taking the bricks for her house somewhere. And so there were a lot of missing bricks, and apparently Chris had to go find the bricks from other locations to replace them to rebuild the wall. But that was a pretty substantial rebuild because there were sections where you could see all the way through the wall.
How the garden is built is another story entirely. So with those, we wanted to make sure that we didn't break the bluestone that we just laid. So the guys actually came in and did the whole subbase for the bluestone courtyard, and it's a rather geometrical challenge. A lot of it has to be laid out really relying on the principles of geometry and less on the dimension. Then we had the guy that was doing the trees come in and put all those palms that we wouldn't be able to get to after the bluestone's laid.
The Gadsden gate, that was starting to have a lot of issues with corrosion, and there's a lot of rust on the gate, and the amount of work that they did to restore that gate is impressive.
I'm always excited when, to see Philip Simmons' gates around Charleston, and, we were able to restore his gates on the building, so that will have a history in itself.
This has been a really fun project to work on, just because I actually kind of like they had this when the restoration or the rehab work first started. They had this big screen to protect pedestrians from construction on the piazza, and it was the coolest protective screen that I've ever seen, because it was like a graphic arts, and it had pictures of these Victorian women on the piazza. But that was a really artistic way and attractive way to hide a construction project. I think that some of the creativity has been interesting.
We pulled off our first wedding.
We made it work, just like we said we would. Not everything was completely done, but the bride had no idea, so that was what was most important.
There's little things here and there that are behind the scenes that have to get finished, but it's a work in progress, and it's also an old home, so there's always going to be work to be done and updates to be done. But a lot of people walk through here and are amazed at how new and fresh it feels, especially ones who came through in February, March, and they saw completely gutted and construction work everywhere. So it's a nice treat for all of us to walk through and get these events going.
So that was our first wedding, and then since then we've had actually quite a few other events, but I've got quite a few weddings here this month and then next month as well. Next spring is booking up quickly, and then next fall is totally booked for Saturdays for weddings, which is great.
I mean, this is truly more than I even thought that it would be when we came and toured the house back in November, almost a year ago. I mean, I couldn't have imagined everything from the details to the lighting to outside the courtyards and the gardens. I mean, it's a beautiful venue, and it's definitely #1 in town. Not just from my opinion, but a lot of people in town think so too. So it's above and beyond my expectations.
I think with one of these projects, you've also got to look at it in the round and say both what I want to do and what do I want to leave behind. My work now will outlive me by a long chalk when my name is forgotten, and it is right to do things properly. Sometimes that costs a little more. Sometimes it doesn't, surprisingly. With the Gadsden House, as an example, we have stripped back every single improvement, probably in the last 80 years. It's gone. We were down to the studs, and we need not have taken it that far, but we couldn't have done it as well without doing that.
I would say the budget was close to being in line, but whenever you're dealing with a historic renovation, there are things that you don't see. Even if you're pretty strong on your budget, I know we're going to do these items, but when you pull a wall down and start moving items, that changes things. So we were very close on our budget, but the things that exceeded the budget were worthy cost items, and the three investors had no problem making those things happen. The end result is beautiful. I think the heart and pain of just going through the process and making sure that, like I said, the compliance was there, the subs were legitimate in their services and their documentation. But just being able to come on site and, say I just spent $200,000, what did I spend it on? And being able to see it come to life. The house took its own character.
It always was a wedding gift, and now it's seen more weddings. That's it. This is the Gadsden House. It's nearly a wrap. More than 1,000 hours labor a week, 2,200-year-old bricks we had to find, 14 tons of concrete to hide inside a historic house, a half a ton of lime, 2,000 feet of 200-year-old heart pine to match the original. We made fireplaces, we made windows, crown moldings, we made medallions, we made doors, all to match, and built the place to the standard you would a school or a hospital, because of the utility and the amount of use that it's going to have, and yet still maintain some of the historic character of the place. It was probably the biggest one in the city this year. Not the biggest piece of construction, but the biggest historic renovation. Lots of eyes on us, which is a tad nerve-wracking for our team, but we got away with it.
Yes, I think the project was a big success. We're really excited about the transformation of this building. For many years, I was kind of worried about the way it looked, and it just didn't seem to be reaching its full potential. But now, especially I drive down East Bay Street every morning, and I see that chandelier that's lit up usually every morning, and it just sparkles, and the building is alive again.
And we'll hand this particular house on. It was one of the 10 that they really worried about. There is no need to worry anymore.